There is a moment that happens to almost every person, at least once in their life. You are sitting across from someone, a friend, a stranger, a version of yourself in the mirror, and instead of speaking, you say nothing at all. And in that nothing, something enormous happens. The air changes, the room listens, and somewhere inside you, a question rises, without asking to be invited. What is this silence actually saying? We have been taught, almost from the moment we could speak, that words are the currency of truth, that the loud voice wins the room, that the person who explains the most, defends the most, argues the most, must be one who cares the most, who knows the most, who is the most alive. And so we grew up chasing noise. We filled silence like it was a wound that needed covering. We rushed to answer before the question had even finished landing. We mistook talking for thinking, and noise for presence. But somewhere along the way, maybe in a quiet room, maybe in a long night, maybe in the pause after a loss, you discovered something that could not be unlearned. You discovered that silence is not empty, silence is not absence, silence is not weakness or awkwardness, or something to be quickly filled before it becomes unbearable. Silence, when you finally learn to sit inside it instead of running from it, becomes a mirror, and what it reflects back is not a lack of intention. It is intention in its purest, most undiluted form. Today, we are going to walk into that mirror together. We are going to look, without fear, at what a person's quietness truly reveals. Not the shallow, surface-level reading of it, not the anxious guessing game of why didn't they text back, or why did they go quiet in the meeting, but the deep psychological truth beneath it, because underneath every silence is a signal, and underneath every signal is a soul trying in its own way to tell you something it cannot yet say out loud. This is not a speech about becoming quieter for the sake of being mysterious. It is not about withholding love, or punishing people with distance, or performing calm while secretly seething. That is not silence. That is suppression wearing silence's clothing, and we will learn together to tell the difference. This is a speech about awakening, about recognizing that the quiet moments in your life and in the lives of the people around you are not gaps to be feared. They are doorways. And on the other side of every one of those doorways stands a truer version of who you are, waiting patiently, the way truth always waits, without needing to raise its voice. So take a breath. Let your shoulders drop an inch. And let's begin where every real transformation begins. Not with more noise, but with the willingness to finally listen. The first thing that silence reveals is mastery over the self, not perfection, not the absence of feeling. Mastery. There is a particular kind of person who, when provoked, does not explode, when insulted, does not retaliate in kind, when cornered by chaos, does not add their own chaos to the pile. And for a long time, the world has misread this person as cold, as distant, as somehow lesser than the ones who react instantly and visibly. But what is actually happening inside that quiet person, in that suspended moment before they choose not to speak, is one of the most sophisticated acts the human mind is capable of. It is the act of separating stimulus from response. It is the space, invisible but real, where a person decides not to be ruled by the first emotion that arrives. Think about the last time you were deeply provoked. Someone said something that cut close, that triggered an old wound, that made your chest tighten and your jaw clench. In that instant, your nervous system wanted one thing: release. It wanted you to snap back, to defend, to prove, to win. That is not a character flaw, that is biology. That is thousands of years of survival wiring, doing exactly what it was built to do. But here is the quiet miracle that some people have learned, often through pain, often through years of watching their own words cause damage they later regretted. The ability to feel the fire and not immediately hand someone the match. This is what true silence often is. Not the absence of emotion, but the presence of enough self-command to let the emotion move through you without commanding your mouth. And when you begin to understand this, you begin to see the quiet people around you differently. That co-worker who didn't defend themselves in the meeting, maybe they weren't weak. Maybe they were choosing their moment instead of their impulse. That friend who went quiet during the argument, maybe they weren't shutting you out. Maybe they were refusing to say something in anger that they would have to spend years trying to take back. This is the first shift I want you to make today, and it is not a small one. Stop equating stillness with absence. A calm sea is not an empty sea. It is simply not performing its depth for you. Somewhere beneath that surface, there is more movement, more current, more life than the loudest storm could ever show. And when you start living this way yourself, when you start choosing the pause over the outburst, not because you are suppressing what you feel, but because you respect yourself too much to let a fleeting emotion write a permanent sentence, you begin to reclaim something that noise had quietly stolen from you. You begin to reclaim your own authorship. You stop being a character reacting to the plot. You become the one writing it. This is not about becoming a stone. Stones do not grow. Stones do not evolve. What we are talking about is something far more alive than that, the discipline of the river, not the rigidity of the rock. A river does not fight every obstacle by crashing loudly into it. Sometimes it goes quiet, gathers itself, and finds another way around, and in that quiet redirection it loses none of its power. It simply refuses to waste its power on a fight that was never going to serve its journey. This is the first gift of silence. It teaches you where your power actually lives, not in your volume but in your composure. Consider how differently two people can walk away from the exact same insult. One replays it all night, drafts the perfect comeback in their head, maybe even sends a message they will regret by morning. The other feels the sting just as sharply, but lets it pass through them like weather passing through a valley, present, real, and then gone, leaving the ground undisturbed. The difference between these two people is not that one felt less. It is that one has practiced, deliberately and often painfully, the art of not handing their peace over to whoever happens to provoke them. That practice does not arrive overnight. It is built the way any strength is built, through repetition, through failure, through the humbling experience of losing your composure and deciding afterward that you would rather build a different habit than keep paying that price. And there is something else hidden inside this kind of silence that deserves to be named clearly. Restraint is not the same as repression. A person who has mastered their reactions is not a person who has buried their feelings. They are a person who has learned to feel fully without being controlled by what they feel. This distinction matters enormously because so many people, in trying to appear calm, actually just swallow their emotions whole, and swallowed emotions do not disappear. They resurface later, often in places and relationships that never deserve them. True composure processes the feeling before it responds to the world. It says to the anger, the hurt, the humiliation, "I see you, I will deal with you, but I will not let you speak for me right now." That is not suppression. That is leadership over your own inner life, and it is one of the quietest, most underrated forms of courage a person can practice. The second thing that silence reveals is depth of perception. There is an old, almost forgotten truth that most people never stop to consider. You cannot listen and perform at the same time. You cannot be fully absorbing what another human being is showing you, their tone, their eyes, the tiny tremor in their hands, the words they chose not to say, while you are simultaneously rehearsing your next clever line. The mind has limits. And the person who is always talking, always filling space, always needing to be the one with the answer, is very often the person who is seeing the least, because their attention is turned inward, toward their own performance rather than outward, toward the actual truth in front of them. The quiet person, by contrast, is often doing something the world rarely gives credit for. They are watching, not with suspicion, not with judgment, but with the kind of full presence that most people have forgotten how to offer another human being. Think about the people in your life who have truly made you feel understood. Not agreed with, not entertained, but understood. Chances are, in the moment you remember most, they were not saying much at all. They were simply there, fully, without rushing to fix you or top your story with their own. That is not passivity. That is one of the rarest forms of respect a person can give another, the respect of undivided attention. This kind of silence, the silence of deep observation, reveals a person's true intention far more reliably than their words ever could, because words can be rehearsed, curated, performed for effect. But the quality of someone's attention cannot be faked for long. You know, somewhere in your body when someone is truly listening to you versus simply waiting for their turn to speak. And when you learn to become that kind of listener yourself, something remarkable happens. People begin to tell you things they have never told anyone. Not because you asked more questions, but because you finally gave their words somewhere safe to land. This is worth sitting with, because it changes how you should see the quiet you have, perhaps misjudged in your life. The classmate who rarely raised their hand may have been quietly building an internal library of understanding that the loudest voice in the room never had time to build, because that loudest voice was too busy being heard to actually hear. The employee who says little in meetings may be the one who notices the crack in the plan that everyone else missed, precisely because they were not performing confidence, they were gathering truth. Silence, in this sense, is not a lesser form of participation. It is often the deeper form. And here is the invitation hidden inside this truth. You do not need to become the loudest person in the room to matter. You do not need to fill every pause to be valued. Some of the most respected, most trusted, most quietly powerful people you will ever meet are the ones who speak last and speak least. And yet, when they finally do speak, the entire room leans in, Because everyone has learned through repeated experience that this person does not waste words. Their silence has trained the room to trust their speech. This is not a trick, it is the natural result of a mind that chooses depth over display. There is a kind of attention that changes people simply by being given to them. You have probably felt it yourself, perhaps without having language for it. A conversation where the other person did not interrupt, did not redirect the topic back to their own life, did not rush to offer advice before you had even finished describing the problem. In that kind of silence, something in you relaxed. You felt, perhaps for the first time in a long while, that you did not need to perform your feelings to be taken seriously. This is what deep listening does. It removes the pressure to perform, and in removing that pressure, it creates the conditions for honesty to finally surface. It is worth asking yourself honestly how often you offer that kind of attention to the people in your life. Not the distracted nodding while your mind drafts a response, not the polite waiting for your turn, but the full, undivided presence that says, without words, your story matters enough to have my complete attention. This is a discipline, not a personality trait, which means it can be built by anyone willing to practice it. It begins with something as simple as resisting the urge to speak the moment someone else finishes a sentence. Let a small silence sit there. You will be amazed at what people say next, once they realize you are not in a hurry to fill the space they left open. The third thing silence reveals is far more tender, and I want us to move into it gently, because it touches something many of us carry quietly ourselves. Sometimes silence is not mastery. Sometimes it is not deep perception. Sometimes silence is the sound of an unhealed place. It is the voice a person uses when they do not yet have words for what happened to them, or when the words exist but feel too dangerous, too exposing, too likely to be met with judgment instead of care. This is important because if we only celebrate silence as strength, we risk missing the people who are going quiet, not because they have found peace, but because they have not yet found safety. There is a real difference between the silence of someone who has integrated their pain and chosen stillness, and the silence of someone who is still standing inside the wreckage, unsure if anyone will believe them, unsure if speaking will make things worse, unsure if their voice even matters anymore. Both can look identical from the outside. Both can present as calm, but one is rooted in strength, and the other is rooted in fear. And learning to tell the difference, in yourself and in the people you love, might be one of the most emotionally intelligent skills a human being can develop. If you have ever gone quiet after something painful happened to you, I want you to hear this clearly. That silence was not a failure. It was not you being weak or dramatic or difficult. It was your mind protecting you the only way it knew how in that moment, buying you time until you had enough safety, enough distance, or enough language to finally give shape to what happened. Silence in this form is not the opposite of truth. It is truth in its earliest, most fragile stage, truth still gathering the courage to be born. And if you are someone who has noticed a person you love going quiet, withdrawing, softening their presence, answering in fewer words than they used to, I want to offer you a different response than the one most of us were taught. We were taught to chase the silence, to demand explanation, to treat quietness as a problem requiring an immediate solution. But sometimes the most loving thing you can do is not to pry the silence open, but to sit beside it. To say without pressure, I'm here whenever you're ready, and I'm not going anywhere if you're never ready. Because pain that is rushed rarely heals, it simply learns to hide better. But pain that is given patient, non-judgmental space often finds on its own timeline the courage to finally speak. This is where emotional intelligence becomes not just a concept, but a practice. It is easy to be patient with people who are already whole. The real test, the real growth, is learning to be patient with people who are still healing, without taking their silence personally, without demanding they perform readiness before they feel it. This applies to the people around you, and it applies just as powerfully to yourself. You are allowed to not have the words yet. You are allowed to need time before you turn your experience into a sentence someone else can understand. Healing is not a race, and silence in this sense is not something to escape as quickly as possible. Sometimes it is the only honest thing you have to offer, and offering it honestly is enough. Think about how young most of us were when we first learned that certain feelings were inconvenient for the people around us. A child who cries too long is told to stop. A child who asks too many uncomfortable questions is told to be quiet. Over years, without anyone intending real harm, many of us learned a simple, quiet lesson. The safest thing to do with a big feeling is to make it small enough that no one else has to deal with it. That lesson, absorbed early, does not vanish in adulthood. It simply changes shape. It becomes the silence you offer instead of the truth you are afraid will be too much for someone else to hold. If this describes you, there is nothing broken about you that needs fixing in a hurry. There is only a pattern that once kept you safe, and now, perhaps, keeps you smaller than you were meant to be. Growth here does not mean forcing yourself to suddenly announce every private feeling to every person in your life. It means slowly finding the handful of people who have earned enough trust to hear you, and practicing, in small doses, the frightening and freeing act of letting your silence turn into language. Not all at once. Not perfectly. Just one honest sentence at a time, offered to someone who has shown you, through their patience, that your voice will be received with care rather than judgment. And if you are on the other side of this, the one waiting, the one who loves someone currently living inside their own quiet, understand that your steadiness matters more than your words ever could. You do not need the perfect thing to say. You need only to remain present, unshaken by their distance, uninterested in rushing their timeline. Presence without pressure is one of the rarest gifts one human being can give another, and it is often the very thing that finally makes silence feel safe enough to break. The fourth thing silence reveals is discernment, the quiet, deliberate art of choosing what deserves your words at all. This is different from mastery over emotion, and different from observation, and different from unhealed pain. This is about a person who has lived long enough, or grown deeply enough, to understand a simple but rarely practiced truth. Not every comment needs a response. Not every provocation deserves your energy, and not every room is worthy of your full disclosure. This is not arrogance. It is stewardship. It is the recognition that your words, your story, your inner world are resources, finite, valuable, and not owed to everyone who demands them. There is a particular kind of freedom that comes when you stop believing you have to explain yourself to every person who questions you. When someone misunderstands you, and you feel the old urge to over-explain, to defend, to make sure they see you correctly, and instead you simply let them think what they think, because you know your own truth and it does not require their approval to remain true. This is one of the most liberating forms of silence a person can practice, and it often looks, from the outside, like indifference. It is not indifference. It is discernment wearing a calm face. Think about how much of your life you have spent trying to be understood by people who were never actually trying to understand you. Think about the arguments you have replayed at 2 a.m., rehearsing the perfect explanation that would finally make them see. And now ask yourself, what would it feel like to release that need entirely? Not because you stopped caring about truth, but because you finally understood that truth does not need your constant defense to remain true. The sun does not argue with the people who close their curtains against it. It simply keeps rising, keeps warming the people who choose to step outside and receive it, and lets the rest go on believing whatever they need to believe. This is not coldness. This is a kind of grace most of us spend